great pleasure to be here. And although I've prepared a talk on state of European democracy post-Lisbon, I'm happy to answer any questions about British democracy post-elections and what that means for Britain's relations with Europe. So I'm meant to be pointing... okay, so let's go with this. Oops, no, that's not right. Next one. There we go. And talk about what's in the Lisbon Treaty, related particularly to the question of the democratic deficit, democratic accountability, which is my area of research interest and expertise. I'll talk a bit about the supposed new role of national parliaments and why I'm pretty sceptical about what this will involve. I'll talk about what I think of as emerging democratic politics at the European level, which I think is one of the most interesting developments in the EU over the last decade or so. But what's still missing in this process, particularly European Parliament elections don't work the way I think some of us would like them to work. And why on earth don't we have an election of the Commission President? So background for this is, I think, declining public support for European integration since the early 90s. So this is a graph that shows attitudes towards the EU in the solid graph on the left-hand side from Eurobarometer surveys every 6 months. And this is the percentage of people across the EU who think their country's membership of the EU is a good thing. So you can see it peaked in the early 1990s with growing support for the single market, the 1992 programme, and then collapsed after the ratification of the Maastricht Treaty, or in the process of ratifying the Maastricht Treaty after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, a whole range of different reasons, and has sort of hovered around the 50% level since then. So 1 in 2 citizens of the EU think their country's membership of the EU is a good thing. It's incredibly low. It doesn't follow economics. So the dotted line here is GDP growth. So up until the late 80s, we used to say that support for the EU was a fair weather phenomenon. So when the economy was booming, people liked Europe. When the economy was in the tank, people disliked Europe. Whereas what you can see here is from the late 80s onward, the two graphs have separated. It's now much more to do with people's political attitudes rather than their economic interests or their economic attitudes. And people now, a growing proportion of the public, have relatively hard and fast views on the question of Europe. The other thing we have started to notice in the public opinion data is young people, people below the age of 24 in the data, 18 to 24-year-olds, are less supportive of the EU than 24 to 35-year-olds. We used to find that the younger you were, the more supportive of the EU you were. Now, for the first time in the data, we see that the younger generations, the newly politicised generations, are less pro-European than the previous generations, and that's universal. That's across all the EU member states. So it's a big challenge for Europe. How do we engage the next generation of people in Europe, people who in Europe see themselves primarily as national citizens and then may secondarily think of themselves as global citizens rather than as Europeans? So we used to say at the LSE that the LSE stood for Let's See Europe, but it doesn't stand for Let's See Europe anymore. These students come to the LSE and then head off around the world to China or Latin America or wherever. The other big problem is that we have an ongoing concern in Europe relating to the democratic deficit. And I think we're going to see this even more starkly with the current economic crisis, the issue with Greece, and then the bailout that governments are putting together. In procedural terms, you can defend the EU and say, look, it's democratic. We have free and fair elections. We indirectly elect the Commission. We elect our national governments in the Council. We elect our MEPs. There's checks and balances. So in procedural terms, the EU would be able to join the EU. But in substantive terms, the EU is not. The EU is much more like a form of enlightened despotism. So, we elect our leaders, they go off to Brussels, they do their business, and they come home and tell us what they've done. And it's a sort of fait accompli. There's no real contest. There's no real debate about the future policy agenda in Europe that happens at the European level or across the different member states. There's separate national debates that are not really linked up. European Parliament elections are not really European elections, as I'm going to show you. Referendums are much too crude as instruments to tap into sort of attitudes towards the EU. They're mixed up with attitudes towards national governments and so on. So this is the sort of background that you've got to view the Lisbon Treaty. I was expecting that the Constitution was going to fail. In at least one of the member states that said they were going to have referendums when looking at the public opinion data in the build-up. And we now have this Lisbon Treaty, and part of the Lisbon Treaty, you can argue, was meant to address some of these issues. So One of the things in the Lisbon Treaty a lot of people have talked about is a new involvement of national parliaments, a new role for national parliaments, particularly in the legislative process, in the co-decision procedure in particular, for early viewing of documents in the legislative process. We've seen a further extension of the powers of the European Parliament, particularly over the budget, but also over immigration and justice and home affairs and on agriculture. We've now for the first time got the mention of the European Parliament elections in the article on the choice of the Commission President. So the governments must choose a Commission President taking into account the outcome of European Parliament elections. And we have a new provision for a citizens' initiative. We're not really sure how this is going to work, but if you plug citizens' initiative into Google, you come up with a whole range of websites across Europe that are gathering signatures for various different citizens' initiatives. So wait and see. So new role for national parliaments. Sorry, I didn't format properly here. So the protocol on national parliaments says that national parliaments have 8 weeks to examine legislative proposals to police subsidiarity and proportionality. Is this a conflict with national competencies, or is this does this breach the principle of the idea that any action at the European level must be proportionate? People are talking about this being a new thing. My problem, or my view of this, is I don't expect this to have much impact at all. In a sense, this is governments voting for their own powers. We don't, at the national level in Europe, have very powerful national parliaments in most member states. We have powerful governments that dominate their parliaments. And we have some European affairs committees in some countries, like in Denmark in particular, people talk about. But in most member states, this is the governments voting for more power for themselves. Governments dominate their parliaments, governments dominate their committees. And so I really don't see how this is going to work. The other problem I see is relating to the co-decision procedure. So the co-decision procedure, more than 50% of EU legislation, and most of the legislation which is of interest to citizens in Europe in terms of the rules governing free movement of goods, services, capital and labour in the single market, is passed through the co-decision procedure, where the European Parliament has co-equal power with the governments. Now, this is data on the stages of adoption of legislation under the co-decision procedure. There's 3 legislative stages. First reading means that the same text is adopted in the Council and the European Parliament, and then it becomes law. For that to happen, the amendments that are going to be adopted at that stage have to be agreed beforehand by the Council and the European Parliament, and put into the European Parliament and put into the Council, and then it becomes law. So if they disagree at first reading, it can go to second reading. If they disagree again at second reading, so if the texts are not the same at second reading, you have a conciliation committee to resolve the disputes, and then you pass it on to third reading. What's amazing is we've seen this growth in second reading agreements. We've seen, growth in first reading agreements and it's been quite dramatic. So 2008 to 9, the latest data we had here was it's 80% of legislation adopted under co-decision was first reading. This means 80% of the time the Commission initiates legislation, the Council officials sit down with the European Parliament officials and they horse trade and they get a deal, and then the same set of amendments are adopted in the Council and in the European Parliament and it becomes law. The Council does this because they want things done fast and they don't want it to get to the Conciliation Committee, because if it gets to the Conciliation Committee you now have 27 MEPs and 27 government officials sitting around the table. It's a third Parliament. It's not conciliation, which was originally designed for 12 and 12. So the last thing the governments want is to get to conciliation, where there's civil servants negotiating with sort of nimble politicians. So they don't want to get to conciliation. From the European Parliament side, they don't want to go to second reading. Second reading, they have to have a bigger majority to propose amendments. So you need an absolute majority, which means a grand coalition between the 2 biggest parties. At first reading, you just need a simple majority, which means you can either have a coalition to the centre-left or a coalition to the centre-right, and you can ignore the other big party and just build your small coalition. So both sides want first reading agreements. It raises us some serious questions about accountability, deliberation. Backbench members of the European Parliament increasingly voice concerns about this. They don't like this. Governments often say, the deal was done between the presidency and the European Parliament. It's sold by the presidency to the other members of the council. It's the best deal we're going to get out of the European Parliament. If you don't agree to it, it's going to be another year before we adopt something, so agree to it now. It raises big problems about the workability of the involvement of national parliaments. I just don't see how national parliaments can possibly be involved in the co-decision procedure if more than 80% of decisions are adopted at first reading. So a first reading deal can be done very quickly. It gives the national parliaments absolutely no time to scrutinise anything going on in the main legislative procedure at the European level. Having said that, one of the most dramatic things we've seen is the growing power and influence of the European Parliament and growing democratic politics in the European Parliament. In many senses, the European Parliament is much more like a normal parliament than you would expect in two respects. We've seen growing voting cohesion of the transnational parties and growing party competition along ideological lines. So this is data on party cohesion. So this is a cohesion index that goes from 0 to 1. So if every member of a European party group voted the same way in every single vote in a given year, they'd score 1. If they were split down the middle, half voting yes, half voting no, they'd score 0. As a baseline, the Democrats and the Republicans in the US Congress have a cohesion score of about 0.8. The parties in the House of Commons in London have a cohesion score of about 0.98. So you can see, so the groups in the European Parliament are more cohesive. They vote more along ideological party lines than the Democrats and the Republicans do in the US Congress. And voting along national lines, meanwhile, has declined. So everyone thought that you increase the powers of the European Parliament, party cohesion in the Parliament is going to break down. It's pretty easy to vote along on party lines if it doesn't matter. You increase the powers of the European Parliament and suddenly national interests are going to get in there and break down these transnational coalitions. The opposite has happened. We have a highly partisan European Parliament. And we also have an ideological European Parliament. So this is data from coalition formation from 2004 to 2009 from this website, votewatch.eu. I have to declare an interest. I'm the company director of votewatch.eu. But what we do is we track voting in the European Parliament, and this is looking at the voting patterns in the 260 votes in the last Parliament on internal market and consumer protection issues, and the percentage of times the Liberals here in the middle of the Parliament as the reference group, the percentage of the time the Liberals on these issues voted with these groups. So 87% of the time with the UEN, 85% of the time with the EPP, 65% of the time with the Socialists. And so you can see here a centre-right coalition, a centre-right majority bloc in the European Parliament on internal market and consumer protection. The Liberals, UEN and EPP have a majority against the left. Contrast that with civil liberties, justice and home affairs, the same period, 509 votes. In this period, the Liberals, the reference group, 86% of the time voting with the Socialists, 83% of the time voting with the Greens, 70% of the time voting with the radical left, 64% of the time with the EPP. You can see a centre-left majority bloc in the European Parliament on civil liberties and justice and home affairs. So shifting coalitions in the European Parliament. So you get, in a sense, the Liberals are pivotal. In fact, in the current Parliament, the Liberals are on the winning side more than any other group in the European Parliament. They can pick their coalition partners. They vote with the EPP on the right on free market questions. They vote with the Socialists and the left on environmental standards and civil liberties questions. But on average, what it means is that the European Parliament effectively represents the median voter in Europe. The sort of outcomes from the European Parliament are relatively moderate, are relatively centrist. The European Parliament is an effective check on the Council and the Commission. But we're in the current period where the centre-right now dominates in Brussels. We have unified centre-right government in Brussels. So this is data 2005 compared to 2010. This is the European Parliament, the members of the Commission, the heads of government, and the government heads, if you look by QMV rather than numbers. So the light blue here is the EPP, Socialists are in the red, the Liberals are in the yellow. So you can see how the EPP are the largest group in the European Parliament. They have 14 of the current commissioners, 12 of the current heads of government. Don't know why. There's Cameron here, he should be over here. But actually this was January 2010, sorry. And QMV, they have almost qualified majority under QMV. So the centre-right dominate, the mainstream centre-right, Mr. Cameron, dominate the European Parliament. So we have, it's not surprising then that what we get out of Brussels tends to be quite centre-right policies. And therefore, it's not surprising then that voters on the left in France, for example, are increasingly Eurosceptic because what they see is Brussels adopting policies that they disagree with. So that's the kind of, so there's politics in Brussels, there's emerging ideological politics in Brussels, there's politics in the European Parliament, but we don't have European elections. So European Parliament elections, when they were introduced in '79, were meant to lead to pan-European parties, the ability of voters in Europe to express their choices about the direction of the European policy agenda. That's not happened. European Parliament elections across Europe are mid-term national elections. In 1979, when scholars first studied these elections, Karl-Heinz Reif and Hermann Schmidt called a meeting in Mannheim of people from various different member states and said, tell us what happened in your country. And one by one they stood up and said, well, of course my country was different because it was really just a referendum on the government. And then the next one stood up and said, no, my country was different too, because actually, and then they went round and they realised, and they coined this phrase, second-order national elections. In fact, ironically, European Parliament elections have become more second-order. They've become more national since 1979. The novelty factor has worn off. So what happens in European Parliament elections is big parties lose, small parties win, and governing parties lose and opposition parties win. So this is vote share of a party in the most recent national election, and then did they gain or lose votes in the 2009 European Parliament election. So you can see here, if you're a big governing party, you lost about 10% of your votes. If you were a big opposition party, you lost about 4%. If you were a small party or medium-sized opposition party, you gained votes. And that's where, so this was nothing to do with Europe, nothing to do with policies of these parties on Europe, all to do with whether you're in government or not. These are not elections that allow voters to express their views about it. It's rational, of course, for voters to do this because the outcome of these elections don't really make much of a difference in what happens in Brussels. The other big problem is the main political office in Brussels, the President of the Commission, is chosen more like a pope than a chief executive. So, you know, the governments huddle in some sort of room and we wait for the white smoke to come up, and they come out and tell us who they've anointed as their Commission President. So, you know, the Commission President is the first among equals in the Commission. The Commission has a right of legislative initiative. Some people will argue that the Commission is really an executive agent that just regulates. It's not. It's a political body that initiates legislation. That should have a leadership role in the way the EU works, which is fundamentally political. I'll wait until we're off the record before I tell you my anecdote about Barroso. But the socialists were under pressure to nominate a rival candidate to Barroso in the last European elections to put up a candidate against Barroso. And in fact, there was a summit of the socialists in December in Madrid in December 2008, at the Socialist Congress, and the young European socialists were handing out T-shirts that said, who's your candidate? And they were sort of lobbying them to... And they had a meeting, and Brown said, I'm not going to support anyone against Barroso. Because if we support any candidate, there's going to be media coverage of these elections, and the more media coverage of these elections, the worse we're going to do. So let's just pretend these elections aren't happening. Zapatero and Socrates said he's an Iberian colleague. We can't put up anyone against him. And the German Social Democrats said, we're in power in a coalition government in Berlin with Merkel, and Merkel is backing Barroso, and we don't want to upset Merkel. And by the way, we're doing a deal inside the parliament, so we get president of the European Parliament. So, you know, some of the main socialist parties in Europe didn't have the balls to put someone up against Barroso. So we didn't see a debate, we didn't see any candidates. Next time round, I'm hoping that's not going to be the case, because we won't have an incumbent. So there'll be no sort of deal between a sitting incumbent Commission President and the people he meets on a regular basis, who are heads of government. So you won't have this pressure amongst the heads of government to support an incumbent, and we are likely to see rival candidates for the Commission President. I don't want there to be a direct election of the Commission President. All I want is rival candidates on the table, supported by different people, so we can actually look at what they stand for. What are you going to do for 5 years? Let's have a live debate in the European Parliament with simultaneous translation. Let's have media coverage of their profiles of these people and what they're going to do, so we can ask our political leaders, who are you supporting for Commission President and why? I remember when Bertie Ahern was Irish Prime Minister, head of the council when Barroso was chosen, and he came to London to talk to Tony Blair, and they came out of number 10, and they came to the sort of stand outside number 10, and the journalist said, Mr. Blair, who are you supporting for the Commission President? And he said, oh, I'm sorry, but it's the subject of delicate intergovernmental negotiations. I almost threw my shoe at the TV. How on earth can you say this? This person initiates legislation that affects our lives as European citizens. How dare you tell us you're not going to tell us who you support for this post? The journalist just said, oh, okay. On the positive side, Lisbon provides new opportunities for national parliaments and for the European Parliament to shape policy outcomes at the European level. And because of the fact the European Parliament does vote along ideological lines, is a relatively fair representative of the preferences of European citizens, you tend to get policy outcomes from Brussels that are relatively close to the European average. But that's not enough. Supplying policies that are close to the European average is not democratic politics. That's enlightened despotism. That's, there's no debate. Politics is about debate, us making choices, us discussing the policy choices and what the options should be, and choosing whose agenda should lead in the future. The European Parliament elections don't do that. And the way we choose a Commission President doesn't foster any kind of debate. And so that's what I don't like about where we are now. Thanks. That's me.